The war began, as it always did, at 7:03 a.m. Arthur Pembrooke, retired for 5 years and a widower for 3, heard the telltale click-clack of the plastic wheels on the concrete path next door and felt his jaw tighten. He didn't need to look out the window of his beige, meticulously organized bungalow in the Serene Pines 55-plus community to know it was her. Eleanor Vance. The bane of his retirement, the thorn in his side, the living, breathing embodiment of his most frustrating professional memories. He rose from his breakfast nook, where his copy of The Wall Street Journal lay open beside a single boiled egg and a piece of dry wheat toast, and moved to the front window with the practiced stealth of a reconnaissance officer. Peering through the slats of his Venetian blinds, he confirmed the enemy's position. There she was. Eleanor. Dressed in what Arthur could only describe as gardening chic, a wide-brimmed straw hat, a linen tunic the color of a ripe persimmon, and trousers that were fashionably loose. She was dragging her recycling bin back from the curb, but she wasn't just dragging it. No, that would be too simple. She was pausing. She was surveying her rose bushes with a critical eye, then his. Her gaze swept over his own immaculate, if somewhat sterile, front garden. A regimented display of low-maintenance boxwoods and bark mulch, and a faint, almost imperceptible sigh of pity escaped her lips. Arthur saw it. He felt it. It had been this way since the day they'd both moved into Serene Pines, 2 years ago, discovering to their mutual horror that their professional rivalry, which had simmered for 3 decades at Oakwood High, was to continue into their golden years. Arthur Pembroke, former history department chair, a man who believed in dates, facts, and the unassailable logic of cause and effect. Eleanor Vance, former head of the English department, a woman who lived for metaphor, subtext, and the emotional truth of a sonnet. To Arthur, Eleanor's teaching was all fluff and feeling. To Eleanor, Arthur's was dust and dogma. He watched her now, her movements fluid where his were rigid. She stopped, bent down, without a hint of the back pain that plagued him, and deadhead to spent bloom from a magnificent David Austin rose. The flower, a cascade of apricot and cream, seemed to worship her. Everything in her garden did. It was a chaotic, glorious explosion of color. Lavender spilled over flagstone paths, delphiniums stood like proud blue sentinels, and clematis climbed a trellis in a riot of purple. It was the antithesis of his own ordered, masculine space. His bin was already put away, of course. It had been retrieved at 6:58 a.m., precisely. Hers was always late. A deliberate provocation. Just as he was about to turn away, she looked up. Her eyes, a sharp, intelligent blue even from this distance, met his through the slats. He froze, caught. She didn't smile. She offered a small, tight nod, the same nod she'd given him in the faculty lounge for 30 years when he'd made a point about the economic realities of the Civil War that she'd found reductive. He retreated from the window, his heart performing an odd, arrhythmic thump that had nothing to do with his mild blood pressure medication and everything to do with being bested in the morning's first silent skirmish. The feud had tangible fronts, of course. There was the great bird feeder incident of last spring, when he'd complained to the Homeowners Association that the vermin, squirrels, attracted by her artisanal, seed-cake feeder were encroaching on his property and threatening his prized, yet fruitless, cherry tree. She had retaliated by circulating a petition among the other residents to promote biodiversity in Serene Pines, framing his complaint as an attack on nature itself. She'd won. Then there was the ongoing battle of the community book club. Eleanor, naturally, was its reigning queen. Last month, she had selected some sprawling, magical realist novel that Arthur had found intellectually dishonest and structurally unsound. He'd said so, at length, during the meeting held in the community center's multi-purpose room. He'd called the protagonist's flight a physiological impossibility draped in sentimental prose. Eleanor had listened, sipping her herbal tea, before dismantling his entire argument with a quiet, "Arthur, you're looking for the wiring in a stained glass window. Sometimes the beauty is in not knowing how the light gets through." The room, full of their fellow retirees, former accountants, nurses, and engineers, had sighed in collective admiration. He'd left early. Now, finishing his toast, Arthur decided today would be different. Today, he would take the high ground. The autumn festival was approaching, and the community was hosting a harvest bake-off. Arthur was a competent baker. His sourdough starter, named Bismarck, was a thing of reliable, sour perfection. He would bake. He would be civil. He would show Eleanor Vance that he was not the petty bureaucrat she believed him to be. He spent the morning in his kitchen, a space of gleaming stainless steel and measuring cups with exact milliliter gradations. Flour dusted the air as he kneaded his dough with a firm, rhythmic pressure. The process was soothing, a chemical reaction he could control. Yeast, flour, water, salt. Cause and effect. In the afternoon, he ventured out to deadhead his own, less flamboyant, marigolds. He saw Eleanor on her porch, sipping iced tea and reading a thick paperback. She didn't look up. The slight was as potent as a shouted insult. He was about to retreat indoors when he saw Frank Delaney from 3 houses down, a spry former postman, approaching Eleanor's porch with a jovial wave. Arthur watched, his trowel hovering in midair. Frank was always hovering. He saw Frank laugh at something Eleanor said, his hand resting on the porch rail, leaning in too close. Arthur felt a hot, unwelcome spike of something that felt suspiciously like jealousy. It was absurd. He didn't even like Eleanor. But as he watched Frank's easy charm, a memory surfaced, unbidden. The Oakwood High Winter Dance, 1998. He'd been there as a chaperone, standing stiffly by the punch bowl. Eleanor had been there too. She'd worn a dark green dress that made her look different, softer. At one point, a slow song had come on, some sentimental ballad, and for a fleeting, insane moment, he had considered crossing the gym floor and asking her to dance. The moment had passed, of course, buried under a lifetime of accumulated arguments and a shared conviction that the other found them irritating. He'd stayed by the punch bowl. She'd left early. Shaking the memory away, Arthur went back inside, the brief warmth of the autumn sun doing nothing to dispel the chill of his own confusion. The Harvest Bake-Off was held in the Serene Pines Clubhouse, a building that smelled faintly of lemon-scented polish and lentil soup. Long tables were draped in checkered cloths, groaning under the weight of pies, cakes, and breads. The air was thick with the sugary scent of apples and cinnamon and the low hum of friendly competition. Arthur placed his loaf, a perfect, crusty batard, slashed with geometric precision, on the table marked breads. He stood back, hands clasped behind his back, a general surveying his troops. It was a good loaf. A winning loaf. Then Eleanor arrived. She carried not a pie, but a rustic-looking galette, its free-form crust folded roughly over a filling of deep crimson berries, glistening like jewels. It was messy, artistic, and utterly pure. She placed it on the pastries table, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on him. She offered that nod again. The judging commenced. Arthur watched as the panel, comprised of the HOA president, the community activities director, and a local chef, made their rounds. They nibbled, they whispered, they made notes. When they reached his bread, they nodded appreciatively. The chef even broke off a second piece. Arthur's chest swelled. Then they reached Eleanor's galette. They exclaimed over its appearance. They took bites and their faces lit up. Arthur's confidence wavered. It was just fruit and pastry, for heaven's sake. Where was the technique? The discipline? Finally, the head judge, the chef, stood to announce the winners. For the bread category, first place goes to Arthur Pembrooke for his exceptional sourdough batard. A smattering of applause. Arthur stepped forward, accepted his blue ribbon, and allowed himself a small, tight smile of victory. He had done it. He had proven his point. And for the overall best in show, the chef continued, awarded to the entry that displayed not just technical skill, but true heart and creativity. Eleanor Vance, for her stunning blackberry lavender galette. The applause was much louder this time. Eleanor, her cheeks flushed, accepted the large, gilded ribbon. Her eyes swept the room and for a single, startling second, met Arthur's. In them, he didn't see gloating. He saw something else, a flicker of shared history, a silent acknowledgement of their endless, exhausting game. And in that moment, his victory with the blue ribbon felt hollow, childish. After the crowd thinned, Arthur found himself packing his now-ribboned loaf into a basket. Eleanor was nearby, carefully boxing up her galette. "Congratulations, Arthur," she said, her voice quiet. "Your bread looked very precise." He looked at her. The overhead fluorescent light caught the silver threads in her hair. She looked tired. "And your galette," he managed, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. It seemed popular. A small smile touched her lips. "It's an old recipe. My grandmother's. She always said the secret wasn't in the measurements, but in knowing when the berries are ready to burst." Arthur, a man who lived by measurements, was silent. He watched as she struggled to fit the large box into her tote bag. It was an awkward, fumbling movement. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "Here," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. "Allow me." He took the box from her. Their fingers brushed. Her skin was cool, his was warm from clutching his victory bread. A jolt, small but undeniable, passed between them. It was like static electricity, the kind that builds up on a dry autumn day. Eleanor looked as startled as he felt. She withdrew her hand quickly. "Thank you," she murmured. He walked her home in the deepening twilight, the two of them moving in silence down the winding paths of serene pines. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of wood smoke and decaying leaves. It was the first time they had ever walked side by side without arguing. At her doorstep, she turned to him. "Would you like a piece?" she asked, gesturing to the box containing the galette. "It seems a shame to eat it alone." Arthur Pembrooke, a man of routine and ritual, a man who had his evening tea at 8 p.m. sharp, looked at his rival of 32 years, standing in a pool of golden light from her porch lamp, and threw his entire internal schedule into disarray. "Yes," he heard himself say. "I would. Thank you." Eleanor's bungalow was a mirror image of his own in layout, but in every other respect, it was a different universe. Where his was all neutral tones and clean lines, hers was a tapestry of texture and color. Books were stacked on every available surface, not with his military precision, but in teetering, inviting piles. A worn, comfortable-looking armchair was draped with a colorful afghan. The walls were covered in art, watercolors of landscapes, bold abstract prints, and framed quotes from poets he didn't recognize. The air smelled of beeswax, dried lavender, and, faintly, of her, a scent of soap and something else, something green and alive. "Make yourself at home," she said, her voice softer here, in her own domain. "I'll get plates." Arthur stood awkwardly in the center of the living room, feeling like an artifact from a sterile museum placed in a lush, overgrown jungle. His eyes fell on a photograph on the mantelpiece. A younger Eleanor, her hair a cascade of dark brown, stood with a man who had a kind, smiling face. Her late husband, David. He'd died of a sudden heart attack nearly a decade ago. Arthur had, of course, attended the funeral. He'd stood at the back, feeling like an intruder, watching Eleanor, so composed and so utterly shattered, and had felt a pang of something that was entirely separate from their rivalry. It was human pity, a recognition of a profound loss. She returned with 2 small plates, each holding a generous slice of the galette. She handed one to him. "A peace offering," she said, her eyes meeting his. He took a bite. The crust was buttery and flaky, yielding to a filling that was both tart and sweet, with an unexpected, floral undertone from the lavender. It was complex. It was messy. It was, he had to admit, sublime. "It's very good," he said, the admission costing him something. "It's better with this," she said, and produced a small bottle of dessert wine, pouring 2 tiny glasses. They sat, opposite each other, in her cozy living room. The silence was no longer hostile, but thick with unspoken words. "David would have loved this," Eleanor said suddenly, looking at the galette. "He had a ferocious sweet tooth." She smiled, a real, unguarded smile that transformed her face, smoothing the lines of perpetual criticism around her eyes. "He was terrible in the kitchen. Could barely boil water. But he was an enthusiastic taste tester." Arthur didn't know what to say. He'd never known what to do with other people's grief. He opted for a fact. "My wife, Margaret, was an excellent baker." She preferred recipes from her mother. Very traditional. Ah, yes, Eleanor said, taking a sip of her wine. The famous Pembroke adherence to tradition. It wasn't said with malice. It was an observation. And for the first time, Arthur didn't feel the need to defend it. They talked. It started stiffly, a cautious exchange of biographical data, but soon, inevitably, it turned to Oakwood High. But this time, it was different. They weren't debating in the staff room. They were reminiscing on a sofa, with dessert wine and a shared past. Do you remember when the drama club painted the principal's car pink as a prank? Eleanor asked, a genuine laugh escaping her. And you were the one who figured out it was them because you cross-referenced the paint purchase with the club's budget records? I was merely applying logic, Arthur said, but he felt the corner of his mouth twitch. You, as I recall, argued for clemency, citing youthful artistic expression. And you cited vandalism statutes from the 19th century, she shot back, but she was still smiling. They spoke of students they'd both taught, of the leak in the library roof, of the year the football team went to the state finals. The decades of animosity began to feel, in that warm, book-lined room, like a strange and prolonged courtship, a dance of two people who were so determined to be right that they never stopped looking at each other. It was only when his glass was empty and the grandfather clock in the corner chimed 10 that Arthur realized he had missed his 8 p.m. tea entirely. He stood, suddenly embarrassed. I've taken up too much of your evening, he said. Not at all, Eleanor replied, walking him to the door. It was nice. On the porch, the autumn air was cold. The sky was a deep, velvety black, dotted with sharp, bright stars. Thank you for the galette, Arthur said. And the company. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself against the chill. We survived 30 years of each other, Arthur. I suppose we can survive being neighbors. He nodded. He turned to leave, then stopped. An impulse, alien and powerful, seized him. He turned back. Eleanor, he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. The autumn festival dance is next week. I was wondering. He saw her eyes widen in surprise. The old, familiar defensiveness started to rise in him, but he pushed it down. Yes, Arthur, she prompted, her voice barely a whisper. Would you consider going with me? The words hung in the air between them, fragile and astonishing. Eleanor looked at him, her face unreadable in the dim light. The silence stretched, long enough for Arthur to feel the full weight of his foolishness. He was about to retract the offer, to mutter an apology and flee, when she spoke. All right, she said softly. I'll go with you. The week that followed was one of the most disorienting of Arthur Pembroke's life. He felt like a man who had spent his entire life studying a map, only to have it declared obsolete. He found himself looking out his window not with animosity, but with a nervous anticipation. He caught himself wondering what Eleanor was reading, what she was thinking. Their morning bin retrieval ritual continued, but the energy had shifted. Now, when their eyes met, there was a silent, awkward acknowledgement of their upcoming date. Arthur had even, in a moment of unprecedented boldness, raised his hand in a small wave. Eleanor had reciprocated with a slight, almost shy smile before quickly turning away. He spent an inordinate amount of time deciding what to wear to the dance. He laid out 3 different sweater and slack combinations on his bed, critically assessing each one. He finally settled on a navy blue cashmere V-neck that Margaret had given him for their last anniversary together. It felt like a betrayal and an affirmation all at once. The night of the dance, he knocked on her door at precisely 7 p.m., his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. When she opened it, he lost his breath. She was wearing a dress of a deep, wine-red color, simple but elegant, with a silver necklace that caught the light. She looked beautiful. The word arrived in his mind fully formed, undeniable. You look very nice, Arthur, she said, her eyes appraising his sweater. You as well, Eleanor, he managed, his voice tight. The clubhouse had been transformed. Strings of fairy lights twinkled from the ceiling, and a local band was playing a mix of old standards and soft rock from their youth. The multi-purpose room, usually a place of HOA grievances and bingo nights, was suddenly magical. For the first hour, they stood near the punch bowl, a horrifying echo of the 1998 winter dance, making stilted conversation with other residents. Frank Delaney swooped in, charming as ever, and asked Eleanor for a dance. Arthur watched, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, as Frank led her onto the floor. She laughed at something he said, and Arthur felt a fresh wave of that absurd, possessive jealousy. But then something remarkable happened. As the song ended, Eleanor politely extricated herself from Frank and walked back to Arthur's side. "He still has 2 left feet," she murmured, leaning close so he could hear her over the music. A slow song began, something by the Beatles, soft and melodic. The dance floor filled with couples, moving together with the easy familiarity of shared lives. Arthur looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him, a question in her eyes. The moment from 1998, the one he had buried for so long, rose to the surface, no longer a regret but an opportunity. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low, "may I have this dance?" She hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Yes." He led her onto the floor, his hand finding its place on the small of her back, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. They were stiff at first, a pair of former debating champions trying to navigate the uncharted territory of physical proximity. But as the music swelled, they began to relax. He was surprised to find he was a competent dancer. Margaret had loved to dance, and he had learned for her. It was a muscle memory he hadn't used in years. Eleanor followed his lead effortlessly. They didn't speak. They simply moved, their bodies finding a slow, gentle rhythm in the crowded room. He could smell the faint scent of her perfume, something floral and subtle. He could feel the warmth of her through the soft wool of his sweater. Her head was tilted down, and he could see the silver crown of her hair, the delicate curve of her ear. In that moment, all the arguments, all the petty grievances, all the decades of wasted animosity, simply fell away. What was left was the simple, startling truth of 2 people, no longer young, holding onto each other in the soft light, finding a connection they had spent a lifetime denying. When the song ended, they didn't immediately pull apart. They stood there for a moment on the dance floor, surrounded by the swell of the next, faster song, looking at each other as if for the first time. "Arthur," she whispered, her eyes bright. He didn't know what to say. Every fact, every date, every logical construct in his mind had failed him. So he did the only thing that felt true. He squeezed her hand. The truce became a tentative alliance, and the alliance began to feel, unmistakably, like a romance. It was a strange and tender thing, built not on the fresh soil of youth, but on the well-trodden, sometimes rocky ground of a shared past. They started having coffee together on her porch on Saturday mornings. He would bring his sourdough biscuits. She would provide the jam, homemade from the figs in her backyard. They talked about books. He finally read the novel she'd assigned for book club, and while he still found the flying protagonist problematic, he admitted he saw the beauty in the language. She, in turn, read a biography of Winston Churchill he'd recommended and conceded that understanding the historical context did, in fact, add depth to the man's decisions. They took walks through the community, no longer as rivals surveying their territories, but as companions. He pointed out the different species of oak trees. She recited poetry from memory, her voice soft and clear in the quiet afternoons. He learned that her chaotic garden was a map of her life. A rosebush planted when David retired, the lavender from a trip to Provence, the unruly clematis a gift from a former student. One crisp November afternoon, raking leaves from his lawn, a task he performed with Germanic efficiency, he saw her struggling to carry a heavy bag of potting soil from her car. Without a second thought, he marched over. "Let me get that," he said, taking the bag from her. "Arthur, I can manage," she protested, but her protest was weak. "Nonsense," he said, hefting the bag onto his shoulder. "Where do you want it?" He followed her to the back of her garden, to a small, sunny patch she was preparing for winter. As he set the bag down, his eyes fell on a small, weathered stone nestled among some ivy. It was a simple marker, engraved with the name, Toby, and the dates, 2005 to 2020. Eleanor saw him looking. "That was my golden retriever," she said softly. "He was David's dog, really. But he became my shadow after. He kept me company. Arthur, a man who had never been particularly fond of pets, looked at the small stone and felt a lump form in his throat. He saw, in that moment, not just the loss of a husband, but the long, lonely years that had followed, filled only by books, a garden, and a dog. He saw the strength it had taken to build a life of such vibrant beauty in the face of such profound silence. Margaret always wanted a cat, he found himself saying. I was allergic. I used to think it was a small sacrifice. Now, I wonder if it was a selfish one. Eleanor placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was warm and solid. We all make choices, Arthur. We can only see them clearly in retrospect. He looked down at her hand, then into her eyes. The last of his defenses crumbled. Eleanor, all those years, all those arguments, was it really just about teaching methods? She smiled, a sad, wise smile. I think we were always talking about something else, Arthur. We were just too stubborn to listen. He leaned forward, his movement slow and deliberate, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. He kissed her then, a gentle, hesitant kiss that tasted of coffee and autumn air and 30 years of wasted time. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but of profound recognition, of two stories finally merging into one. When they parted, her eyes were closed for a moment before she opened them, looking at him with a clarity that took his breath away. Well, she said, her voice a little unsteady. It's about time. The news of Pembroke and Vance spread through Serene Pines with the speed of a juicy scandal. Raised eyebrows over bridge tables, knowing smiles during water aerobics. Frank Delaney took the news with surprisingly good grace, clapping Arthur on the back and saying, I knew she'd wear you down eventually, you old badger. Winter came, draping their bungalows in a blanket of white. Arthur, who had always seen winter as a season to be endured from indoors, found himself shoveling her walk first, then his. They spent evenings by her fireplace, him reading his history tomes, her grading imaginary essays or writing letters to her grandchildren. The silence was no longer empty, but companionable. One evening, she was looking through an old photo album, and he saw a picture of her and David on their wedding day. They looked so young, so full of a future they couldn't know would be cut short. A familiar, ugly knot of jealousy tightened in Arthur's stomach. He was intruding on a sacred memory. Eleanor, perceptive as ever, closed the album. He was a wonderful man, Arthur, she said quietly. He was my past. A very happy part of my past. She reached over and took his hand. But you are my present. And I hope my future. The simple honesty of her words dissolved the jealousy. He wasn't competing with a ghost. He was being offered a place beside it. Spring arrived and with it, a new challenge. The HOA announced a community vision project, asking for proposals to redesign the barren central courtyard. Arthur, of course, drafted a detailed, formal plan for symmetrical raised beds, labeled with botanical names, and a grid of paved walkways. It was efficient, educational, and utterly charmless. Eleanor scoffed. It looks like a cemetery for plants, Arthur. She drew up her own plan, a secret garden, with meandering gravel paths, a small fountain, a bench tucked under a weeping willow, and a wild, cottage-style mix of perennials. The old dynamic threatened to reemerge. They argued over dinner about flow, function, and aesthetics. But this time, it was different. The stakes were no longer about winning, but about finding a solution. It was Arthur who, after a night of thought, came to her the next morning. He unrolled his plan on her kitchen table, then placed her sketch beside it. What if, he said, pointing, we combine them? We keep the central path wide and accessible, as per my design. But we let the beds on either side follow your wild scheme. We can have the willow and the bench at the far end as a destination. Eleanor looked at the hybrid plan, her critical eye softening into admiration. A structured journey to an unstructured beauty, she mused. It's a metaphor, Arthur. He grunted. It's a compromise. She smiled. It's the same thing. They presented the plan together. The HOA, used to their bickering, was stunned into unanimous approval. On a warm evening in late spring, They sat together on the newly installed bench in the now completed courtyard. Arthur's boxwoods provided structure at the entrance. Eleanor's lupins and poppies ran riot in the beds. The fountain bubbled softly. It was their relationship made manifest in soil and stone. Arthur looked at Eleanor, her face turned to the setting sun, gilding her profile in light. He thought of the decades of wasted time, the stubborn pride, the countless moments he could have looked past the argument and seen the woman. There was regret, yes, a deep and poignant ache for what might have been. But it was overshadowed by a profound gratitude for what was. He had entered the autumn of his life expecting solitude, a quiet winding down of days filled with routine and memory. He had found, instead, a second spring, unexpected and all the more precious for its lateness. The woman he had considered his rival had turned out to be the one person who truly knew him, who had known the worst of him and was now seeing the best. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "We wasted so much time," he murmured into her hair. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "No, Arthur. We were just taking a very long, very complicated route to get here. And the view from here is perfect." In the gentle twilight of serene pines, surrounded by the garden they had built together, Arthur Pembroke finally stopped keeping score. He had lost every battle, only to win a war he never knew he was fighting for the greatest prize of all.